Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In recognition of Banned Books Week, September 22nd through the 28th, we launched our first ILV book club with a series of short discussions of James LaRue's book, On Censorship, A Public Librarian Examines Cancel Culture in the U.S. LaRue's book is a combination of personal reflection and a deep dive into the specifics of book banning. You can participate in a discussion with James LaRue on October 2nd. In the meantime, read On Censorship along with ILV Fellows Elizabeth and Pamela Hayes, Bohannon. This is the second episode, but you can find a link to our first conversation in the show notes. Or jump right in here and listen to us discuss the last 20 or so pages of part 1, starting with what do libraries buy and why, through how to respond to library challenges. Remember to join us for the live meeting with the author on Wednesday, October 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern. You will find a link in the show notes, and you can also find out more by going to ilvalues.org. Hi, welcome back to the second installment of our inaugural book club. We are reading On Censorship, A Public Librarian Examines Cancel Culture. And we are starting at a section called The Surge, 2021-2022. So we covered about approximately the first half of the first section of the book last week. And so this, so obviously this book just recently, maybe in the last year or so, came out, and so he's talking about how censorship changed, and he does mention that in the first section of the book, but now he's being a little more specific here, that he says there was a distinct surge in this time period. Nearly as many challenges between September 1 and December 1 of 2021 that ALA, the American Library Association, normally tracks in an entire year. So that's just a few months. And he's just sort of setting the stage here for the kinds of he says, the weaponization of state government to actively purge institutions of forbidden topics and views, and sort of the tactics that are used here. And in one case, he does mention that in Michigan, they were successful in getting the library defunded. I don't know if you had heard, that was news to me, even though I have relatives in Michigan. I guess I was vaguely aware of it. But
that's kind of like the newest tactic is for people, would-be censors. If they don't get their way, they try to get something onto the ballot that will defund the library. And that has been successful in some cases. Other cases, we can celebrate that it failed, but it's interesting. It's not an uncommon tactic now. That's since 2020. That's new.
And it's interesting because you just mentioned that you wanted to make sure we mentioned the overwhelming support for libraries, in general. And I will get to those statistics a little bit further on, but just in general, the overwhelming support for like public libraries, school libraries. But that doesn't mean those people are voting, right? That doesn't mean those people are aware that they have, we have all faced the kind of twisty, turny, confusing legalese that is in, some kind of thing that we're voting for, where it kind of gets confusing and, that kind of stuff. So, that they are using this kind of, it says 56% of the voters, that's not 56% of the population of Jamestown Township, Michigan, chose not to renew the property tax that was 80% of the library's operational budget. So, yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I didn't read I don't know what specifically those people were voting on, but I know you can always get people rallied around, no taxes, right? We want lower taxes. Right. And, if they don't understand that means the library is going to be defunded, I don't know. So again, you mentioned like this convoluted thing, right? I mean, I have chosen in some cases, not to vote on a certain question on the ballot because I could not understand it. I could
Right.
not understand what would happen. And so I chose not to vote. And so that could very well have been
Could happen too. Yeah.
some of what happened here.
Yeah. So we get to this section on 13 reasons why, which if you would just tell people real quick, like, I mean, you're probably better equipped to tell people about the book and some of the challenges that,
So it's one of the more commonly challenged books, and it was made into a Netflix miniseries. I have not read the book, and I watched maybe 4 episodes of the Netflix series some years ago and didn't think was very good. But the story is that a young adult high school student kills herself and leaves behind, I want to say there were 13 letters, like each one explaining like, here's you're the reason, and it was addressed to 13 different people, if I'm remembering correctly from the 4 episodes I watched some years ago. But that's what I recall. So that, and so, the girl is dead. She did succeed in killing herself and has left these letters. And so it is fiction. And of course, it is a controversial topic, right? And what we read in this book on censorship is that it can people do get ideas about suicide from reading about it. It's not a new idea, and so it's frequently challenged. And so in one case, I think they said it was in Colorado.
yeah.
The principal just walked in and removed the books. And the librarian saved it. They said, no, students want to read this. This is an issue that they are dealing with, and we should have books for them. And they managed to convince the principal, first of all, that there hadn't been a challenge to the book. That was for the first thing, is that no one had actually challenged the book in this particular school. And so, there was a process. First of all, there has to be a challenge, and then there's a process for reconsideration, which none of that had happened. So, and, in addition, the librarian said, we need to have books that our students are interested in and on topics they're dealing with for real. And the book was kept. Along with, this is the right thing too. The librarian said, we need to give the students more information about suicide and mental health. And so the school put on this, they put up a website with more information for the students. Like, the antidote for bad information is more information. It's more information, right? So, good news, except what? The next thing happens is that the author of the book gets caught up in the Me Too movement. And so now the librarians want to remove the book themselves because the author is problematic. We saw that with Harry Potter too. First it was the right that came for Harry Potter because witchcraft. And Harry Potter gets away with stuff. He doesn't get punished. There's no consequences for his bad behavior. Whatever. There's a long list of reasons why people came after Harry Potter. Everybody loved it. They are good stories. I still like to read Harry Potter. But then J.K. Rowling comes along and it says some problematic things about trans women, and now the librarians want to get rid of the Harry Potter books too.
So we'll defend against the right, but we'll join the left, basically, is kind of what this section is suggesting, right? That, oh, well, if it's Me Too, or if it's Bill Cosby or whatever. And, I was thinking, like, should we race, like, for example, any bill that was proposed by a politician that later, got into trouble? Well, no, that we'll just take that off. That's like, well, wait, don't we have a bill about that? Shh, we don't mention that. Shh, shh. No, we would never, no, that was a bill that was voted on. And, do we get rid of speeches and that kind of thing, by, cheating politicians, or, what? No, we don't do that. That's part of our history,
Yeah,
and I just thought the list is long of things that we would have to get rid of.
Yeah, you probably remember, you and I are the same age. Back in the 90s, some people had done, a little digging about Martin Luther King Jr. I was living in Arizona at the time, and we were voting on a ballot initiative to make his birthday a state holiday. And so the people who were against it were digging deep, and they come up with, oh, well, he cheated on his wife, and, he, there's evidence that he plagiarized some of his dissertation. And, they did have the evidence for it. But that doesn't negate the good work that he did.
Right. And right? So maybe you don't want a holiday because of that. I don't know. Maybe you say, oh, only saints can have a holiday.
Except we would have to get rid of a lot of holidays.
We sure would. We sure would. Yeah.
We would have to get rid of a lot of holidays if we held that standard to everyone else who had a holiday, yes. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, and I was thinking, like, oh, they still play lots of Michael Jackson music, for example, on the...
Although I did read regarding Michael Jackson, he was in an episode of The Simpsons once upon a time, back when The Simpsons, like back in the 80s, when he was still big, he did a voice of a character. You cannot find that episode anymore.
Oh, now just to be clear, Michael Jackson was acquitted, of course. So, so just to be clear, Dr. Seuss, you've mentioned Dr. Seuss many times, in our conversations, and I don't know enough about Dr. Seuss to know, but, this author says, that he spoke and wrote against racism.
Yeah.
I did not know that Laura Ingalls Wilder's work was accused of being, anti-Indian. She was telling a historical story. I'm sure there was plenty of anti-Indian, anti-Native American bias.
There's lines like the only good Indian is a dead Indian. That's the one I keep hearing people bring up, which again, so maybe the Little House books don't need to be part of the canon anymore, right? That maybe they're not the ones that are going to always be read in elementary school. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be available and that we can't talk about historical time, right? Why did they say that? Why did they say that?
That's what I was going to say is we shouldn't, I think it's my personal opinion, it would be wrong to deny that those biases existed in the past, and to therefore celebrate, the progress that we've made, and as a society as a whole. I think that, I certainly grew up revering Native Americans and Native American culture, and I read every Laura Ingalls Wilder book, or had it read to me, and I don't remember this sentiment. I'm not saying it wasn't there, but it certainly wasn't there to any extent that it stood out to me. I remember more like them just scraping by to live.
Right. And this is the thing. I mentioned it last week when I said, that I tried to read the Twilight books 10 years later, and it just wasn't like, I couldn't understand why I liked them. Books speak to us at different times in different ways at different points in our lives and in society, right? So that those books were beloved by people of our generation, And we didn't notice, right? We didn't notice
Right.
that. It doesn't mean it wouldn't be noticed now.
Right.
And again, if we're noticing it, then we should talk about it.
Right. But let's not black it out of books or whatever. I don't know. It just, that's my, my opinion. So he talks about 3 right-wing organizations: Moms for Liberty, CatholicVote.org, and just generally speaking, the GOP in this section, sort of that, sort of a Tea Party kind of version of cancellation, ginning up fear and anger, and he really connects this to the election. So he pretty explicitly says people did this until the election was over. People did this until the midterms were over. So he's pretty clear that he believes that this stuff happened during this time as a political move. And it made me think about sort of this, I think, maybe I'm wrong, I think that libraries and librarians think of themselves as being this sort of like place of neutrality. I mean, you and I wrote something about sort of the utopia version, just sort of this Pollyanna-ish maybe version. And to me, I'm reading this as sort of the libraries are the hub of politics, that they are the sort of like this, like if it's happening at the library, then it's a sign of things to come, or a sign of trends, or a sign that, I don't know, divisiveness or something like that. And I don't know, I just wondered what you thought of that. And if you noticed that, if that's just me. So it's right before the importance of public engagement. So it's right where he's talking about like Moms for Liberty and stuff, but it appears several times in this section that it's like, oh, this happened and then the midterms were over. This happened and then the election cycle was over.
Well, I will say that libraries have always been very political places. And, we've both worked in public libraries, and we know that, funding is always an issue. And people can, I don't want my tax dollars. Right. I don't want my tax dollars going for whatever. Right. Why do we need all these people? You can just have a volunteer, why do you have these books that I don't like? I don't want my tax dollars paying for these books. Right. And just, in general, funding for public libraries, as much as people think we need them.
Right.
They also always think that, we don't need to pay our employees that much, that, we should just get volunteers to do it. So, and yeah, also, it's not over. It's absolutely not over. It's still happening. It's only, it's going to get bigger. It's going to get bigger now.
Yeah. So anyway, I just thought he definitely connects this to an election cycle.
Right.
And he does say somewhere, he's like, but there'll be another election,
Right.
But he's definitely connecting this to an election cycle.
And I mean, we're right at the, the beginning of, the presidential cycle, presidential election cycle, with some, big news regarding somebody trying to assassinate one of the candidates. If you don't think that that's going to start a whole new cycle of this, it will. And, I saw one opinion piece that actually said if the would-be assassin had been successful, we'd probably already be in a civil war right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I,
so do you think that will impact, libraries, librarianship? You see those kinds of specific events as?
Yeah, I do. I mean, this is big. And uh, the base will be rallied. And I can't even imagine. Yes, I
empowered
can't
to
even.
do more
I can
more censorship, more of, more of what there are, because there will be this sense of empowerment. Yeah. So in contrast to that, he does talk about that his library, also in Colorado, about this, the comic books. And he does say that his board made a surprising decision. They voted to ban banning. And, so I had like a little yay moment there. And he does tell another story about a woman. This is a little bit later, but he tells a story about a woman who went through the process of trying to get a book pulled from the shelves at his library that most people who read it did think that there was a racial element to it, and they even contacted the publisher and stuff, but they ultimately didn't pull the book. But she felt honored and heard and everything, and eventually joined the library board and did her own "we don't ban books" kind of thing. And it was so that was a lovely story, very uplifting and stuff that people we all can come to understand.
Right. And what happened, because they listened to her. They listened to her. They didn't just make her feel listened to. Right. They didn't make her, they actually listened to her. And then when there was an opening on the board, they invited her. Right. They knew she cared about the library. That was the thing. They knew she cared about the library, and they invited her in. And they were able to reach that important understanding. I loved the surprise ending too to that story, that the patron a couple of years later found a copy of the book at a bookstore, and they'd actually changed the illustration that she had complained about, even though they had never responded. They had never responded to the library. But I mean, that was important. That was an important part of letting her know that she'd been heard. We wrote to the publisher and asked them, we're not just making you feel heard, we are hearing you.
And we're not just telling you no.
Right. We're right. They took proactive steps.
Yeah. Now, I'm probably making more out of this because there's no statistical test of this or whatever in here. But, did you find it at all interesting? Did you even notice this? So he's talking about voters across the political spectrum have a sense of the importance of public libraries. 95% of Democrats, 87% of Republicans. And then then less than both of those groups is independents, 78%. School libraries, 96% of Democrats, 91% of Republicans. Again, less than both of those, 85% of independents. I just noticed it that in both those cases, it was the independents who were the people who claimed they were, we don't know even if they were registered independents, they just considered themselves independents. I don't know, how those questions were asked or anything, but I did find it kind of interesting that the Republicans and the Democrats had more in common. They had the most in common in terms of their support. And so I did not look up the original reference, which he does reference it here. So I could have and maybe should do that. Then we get down to, he calls this section a theory of librarianship. And he says, that approximately 97% of our collection reflected more traditional heterosexual centered viewpoints. We were doing precisely what the Challenger said that we should do. We weren't just overwhelming our library with LGBTQ stuff, flooding. No, only about 3% of books on, were on topics that were, any of these categories, gay, homosexual, LGBTQ plus, any related terms to those things, only 3% of the books. And he said, for some people, 100% is barely enough. And I would say that that is absolutely true of woke activists as well. That, maybe they aren't engaging in the formal banning, but the informal part, I definitely think that there's a lot of pressure to, again, everything must be purified, from both extremes. It must be purified. So we have to, put the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, because if they, include anything negative about Native American persons or culture or whatever, they must be, that's another sort of like 100% ban, can't be in there. And I know when I worked in the library, we would find, I'm sure this happened to you many, many times, Sharpie, like marking out parts of texts that people found were offensive to them. So I think that it's, he says for some people 100% is barely enough. And I think that's true of, extremes on both sides, sadly. So,
and what that section, I mean, it goes on to say about libraries spanning time. They're not just reflecting what's going on now. They are reflecting what we read before. And, you and I talked recently, and I mentioned a book I had read by Pat Boone that was written, it was written for teen girls, like advice for teen girls written by a grown man, and it was written, I think it was published in the 50s, and I said, I told you it was super sexist, just always look your best for your man kind of crap, and it's okay that it was in the public library, because I wanted to read it. I found out about the book. I found out the book existed in the 90s, and I wanted to read it. And lucky for me, it was in the public library because it gave me a window onto the 50s, a time when I was not even alive. It gave me a window onto that time period, and that's part of what we do.
And it's so valuable to know. I mean, no, we don't have to be historians to be interested and to gain from learning about history. And how will most of us learn about history, not from checking out, history books, but from checking out books that are historic, that were historical, like you said, little time capsules of that time period. Relics. I mean, learning about that it's so much better than reading some encyclopedia entry about, how women were,
right. I make my own determination about Pat Boone's books. I don't read about what somebody else thinks about Pat Boone's book. Right. I made my own determination about it because I'm a smart person and I can do that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's how he ends that little section is, some people are seeking to erode the explicit institutional mission of the library and replace it with something else, the advancement of their own agendas. And so I loved and hated the part about the Boy Scout handbook. Loved and hated it. Yeah.
Yep. And I highlighted this section that says, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, FDR spurred the nation to unite and act collectively. After 9/11, George W. Bush encouraged us to keep shopping. That's very telling. And I do remember George Bush saying that. It's not something like he said that. And I remember being upset about it at the time, right? This is what you have to say about this?
Yeah.
And we should be able to find out that George Bush said that.
Yes.
I can be angry about it, and I don't want it purged from the historical record.
Right. He does include the Library Bill of Rights here, which, I mean, I've joked around several times, like you can practically hear the national anthem playing in the background when you read these. I recommend everybody read those. And he does then get into sort of left-wing political challenges. He talks about very, very briefly, very superficially, critical race theory. And, then we get into, can free speech and social justice coexist, which is something you and I have talked about.
It's something that needs to be talked about. And I understand why people think it can't, why some people think it can't. It's they walk a fine line together, but my view is that free speech is social justice. The book also mentions about, it's the books by marginalized people that are most frequently targeted. And he mentions LGBTQ and people of color. And I was just reading something, an article that pointed out that there's a lot of overlap with the books that are being targeted, the ones, that are being targeted because of LGBTQ themes or, themes of race, with people who have disabilities. And it's just not floating to the top because there's other reasons why those books are also being banned, usually having to do with sex. Like, I don't know, like people with disabilities having sex. We can't have that. But it's the sex in the book. But this article had actually done the author had done an analysis and determined that it was a huge number of books that featured disabled peoples who were, it was, the intersection, right? The intersection of disability and race and sexuality. It's just that piece of it isn't the piece that's getting the press.
Right. So, and I, he says, and we agree that these two values, and I do disagree. I don't like the word "the." So sometimes there is certainly tension between the two values. I guess it makes it sound like there are only two, which, I think, but anyway, it's like a little like thing with me or whatever, but they're not opposed. And I think, I agree. I think that, we are on the same road together, right? So free speech and social justice are on the same road together. They're traveling the same journey through time, right? Through this time, which is reflected in the library collections and in the library, collection policies and all that kind of stuff. This sort of, journey that we are all on together to find this, sometimes they're holding hands, free speech and social justice. And sometimes they're like crossing the street to be on the sidewalks opposite each other, but never really
parallel.
Yes, they really are, and he does, I'm no philosopher, but he does mention, certainly I have heard this phrase so many times, the marketplace of ideas, John Stuart Mill, and describing free speech as the marketplace of ideas. But this author notes, and I really thought I highlighted this, perhaps we need to admit that every market has a certain percentage of junk. So the superior product the cream does not always rise to the top. The superior product, whether that's a book or, library use policies or whatever, that, every market does have a little bit of junk in it. And, if we pay too much attention to the junk and,
Right.
this is one of the arguments that you made several times about the library owning something is, you get to visit Pat Boone's book without buying it. Like we can look at these books and make choices about them without purchasing them. And, without contributing to, it's like, oh, I can learn about this thing, learn about somebody's opinion that, by the way, I think is wrong or something like that, or, misguided or incomplete. and not contribute to that author's pocketbook and there's real value in that. Again, we're building knowledge systems, right? Like we should know about the alternative arguments and stuff in order to get to really figure out who we are, and who more than teenagers, young, middle schoolers and high schoolers are trying to figure out who they are, and should be exposed to as much as appropriately possible, I guess.
Appropriately possible. I
yes.
like that. Yeah.
So anyway, so he ends with a couple of little stories, or he almost ends this section with a couple of little stories. But the last one is this appeasement. Does appeasement work? And, you and I were caught up in a cancellation thing and everything. And one of the things that, that we kept saying is we're not apologizing for for following the guidelines. We're not apologizing for doing good science. We're not apologizing, it's all these, it's like, and I think he does a really good story here, really good job here of telling the story of why appeasement doesn't work, because the librarian folded, and what happened? The people who worked for her felt like they couldn't trust her, and the 11 people who called and complained now felt especially empowered, right?
And they probably weren't heavy library users to begin with. That's right. I'm guessing, but they're not going to be. Here's what I can pretty almost positively say is that they're not going to be supporters of the library over this. They're not going to say, oh yeah, they're not going to rally behind the library and be the ones to vote for, higher taxes to fund the library. That didn't happen either. They're going to probably pull this story. If there's ever a ballot initiative to defund the library, they're going to pull this story out, oh yeah, because they let bad, programming through. So, that if I vote against the library, I never have to worry about that program ever again.
Well, and again, people going back to the first section, our previous talk, people don't go to the grocery store for what's not there. People don't go to the library for programming that's not there, right? So they don't suddenly become, it's like, oh, they didn't do a program that they had never done before. They didn't do something new. So therefore I'm suddenly going to start going to the library, or start supporting it, or start donating to it, or whatever. So yeah, sort of flipping it around that way. People don't go, they don't go to the freezer section. It's like, yay, Brussels sprouts aren't there, so I will definitely go to that section. So we're all, basically, the next section starts with cancel culture, and so we should probably stop here and start with the next section 2, cancel culture, with our next talk.
Right.